Our meditation today is called Afraid and Alone, Jacob Prayed, based on Genesis 32:22 to 31. Jacob's was a life full of troubles. He had trouble at home, he had trouble away from home, and he had trouble coming back home. Through all his troubles, his God found a way to rescue him. Continuing with our series in the book of Genesis, our episode today, we find Jacob in trouble away from home. For a reviewer, Jacob married the two daughters of his uncle Laban, and in spite an unfair compensation for all his labor, the Lord managed to prosper Jacob, be it through the usual Jacobin way with a little trickery here and there. But after 20 years of sojourn working for his uncle turned father-in-law, Laban's own children became concerned that Jacob was prospering while their father's livestock was declining in number. To them, Jacob was taking away everything their father owned. That suspicion brought tension to the relationship between Jacob and Laban. There was a falling away between the in-laws. The Lord whom Jacob met at the Bethel, while he was running away from home, told him it was time to go back to his relatives in his father's place. And so Jacob went. He fled secretly, the same way he left home some 20 years in the past. He took with him his entire family, wives and children, and everything he had. It took all of 3 days before Laban noticed his son-in-law, daughters, and grandchildren were gone. They probably lived some distance away from one another, or given the tension in the family, they probably were not talking or visiting with each other as much anymore. It was probably a case of emotional distancing. At any rate, learning that Jacob had fled, Laban's feelings were hurt that Jacob would do that to him. His main beef was that Jacob did not give him the chance to say goodbye to his daughter and grandchildren so he could send them with his blessings. Laban pursued and caught up with Jacob and his family after 7 days of pursuit. After clearing the air between the two of them, they parted ways amicably, sealed by a covenant and an oath between them at Mizpah with the famous benediction, "The Lord watch over you and me while we are away from each other." So now that Jacob is relieved of his problem with his father-in-law, he is faced with yet an even bigger problem: how to face his twin brother Esau, whom he cheated of his birthright 20 years in the past. In our episode today, we find Jacob alone by the ford of the Jabbok, in fear and in distress, not certain how his twin brother will receive him. He does not know if his brother had forgiven him or not. His advanced scouts informed him that his brother was meeting him with 400 men in tow. So he prayed. When we find ourselves in trouble, isolated, scared, and distressed, the first best thing we can do is pray. That is exactly what Jacob did. Unlike the earlier prayer he had at Bethel, however, his prayer was no longer conditional. His prayer instead was cognizant of his humble beginnings, how he only had a staff with him when he first met God, and grateful of how much the Lord had prospered him in the land of his uncle. But now, afraid and uncertain how his brother will receive him, Jacob now implores God to save him. On top of that, he also prepared gifts to appease or to pacify his brother. Lots and lots of gifts in livestock. 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewe and 20 rams, 30 female camels and their young, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. And I'm enumerating all this only to say that Jacob must have really been blessed materially to be able to afford such sizable amount of appeasement gift. He sent those gifts ahead through his servants with clear instruction to let his brother know that he is not too far behind. Yet he stayed far behind at camp to see how things will turn out. That same night, the Bible tells us, Jacob also emptied himself of all his wealth, his valuable family included. That night, he got up and took his family with him, and he had them cross the ford of the Jabbok. There he gave them all his possessions. So now we find him alone. He had nothing. He was scared. Only thing he could do was pray. That same night, he wrestled with God in prayer. He prayed all night. So intense was the wrestling match, his hip bone gave up. That is the biblical historian's way of saying, Jacob prayed hard and long. He would not stop until he got his answers. With his body in a difficult praying position perhaps, he suffered a dislocated hip bone. And indeed, before daybreak, Jacob got the answers he needed. God blessed him first by changing his name from Jacob to Israel, for he has struggled with God and with humans, and he has prevailed. He has overcome. God also assured him that his brother Esau will do him no harm, that he will be received well. Got up in the morning and called the place Peniel, because in that place, he said, he saw the Lord face to face, and his life was spared. From that day on, he walked with a limp, a permanent reminder of the touch from God during the most troublesome day of his life. This text before us is obviously a lesson in prayer, more specifically a lesson on how to prevail upon God through unrelenting prayer. But similarly, it is also a lesson on how prayer should work. Prayer does not only move the hands of God or change God's mind, it also changes the nature of the man who prays. Jacob's nature from the beginning was faulty. It was flawed. His name meant a cheat or a supplanter, and his character can make use of some mending or making over. True to his original name, Jacob cheated his brother, his own father, and later his uncle-turned-in-law. In the episode of his life we're considering, his cheating ways finally caught up with him. He had to face the consequences of his past actions. Alone, afraid, and stripped of his wealth, he prayed God to save him. And graciously, God did. The first thing God did to him was to change his name, to save him from himself. Who knows what trouble he would have caused had he not changed. In the Bible, a change of name is equivalent to a change of nature or character. In the New Testament language, it is called being born again. In the language of Paul, it is known as regeneration. From Jacob, God changed his name to Israel, one who has overcome in his wrestling with God and man, the name by which God's people will eventually be named. Not covered in our text, but let me squeeze it in anyway. Within the context of the episode of the life of Jacob that we are considering, is the beautiful way with which conflicts between Jacob and his father-in-law Laban and his twin brother Esau were resolved. In Genesis 31, after 7 days of pursuit, Laban and his relatives caught up with Jacob and his family. They cleared the air of animosity between them and pledged never to do harm to each other. For Jacob never to harm nor be unfaithful to his wives. And they even took God as their witness to the oath they made. Then they had a feast. Laban blessed his daughters and grandchildren, and amicably they parted ways. I've always wished that all the conflicts, be it within the family or within the church family, were resolved that way. Almost the same thing happened between Jacob and his brother Esau. Esau at the time has also prospered and did not need the gifts Jacob sent ahead. But Jacob insisted that his brother accepted the gifts, perhaps trying to make up for the blessings he stole from his brother earlier in their former lives. Jacob was afraid to meet his brother, who has 400 men with him. But Esau, upon seeing his younger brother, ran to him, embraced him, allaying all his fears, an act of two people reconciled. All is well, and Esau was putting the things of the past behind the two of them. So they embraced, and I would not be surprised if they did it in tears. This act of reconciliation reminds me of the details of Jesus' parable of the prodigal son. Jacob came back and his older brother ran to embrace him. In the parable, it was the father who ran and embraced his long-lost son. In the parable, the older brother would not forgive. He would not come into the house to celebrate. He missed the pure joy that true forgiveness and reconciliation brings. And so are all those who have not learned the grace of forgiving. Again, Jacob's life is complicated and full of troubles, to say the least. But with a change of name, with lots of prayers, with lots of intervention from his God, Jacob became the father of the 12 tribes that became the foundation of the people of God. In our own lives and faith journeys, should we find ourselves in trouble, afraid, and alone, it is good to go to God in relentless prayer like Jacob did, trusting God will intervene in our behalf so we can experience the joy of being forgiven and accepted and reconciled. I also hope that flawed and faulty as our lives might be, I hope and pray that God will also weave His way to accomplish His plans through us and in us, in our time and in our place, as He did for Jacob. Amen and amen.